it would be great to talk about the theme for the Met exhibit. Now, this confuses people a lot, so I just need to mention this just in case. The Superfine Tailoring Black Style is the theme for the exhibit in the museum. It's not actually the Met Gala theme. Now, of course, the theme for the exhibit and the theme for the Met Gala, they normally coincide. They're normally similar. A lot of times they're not exactly the same, but they're similar. So the theme for the exhibit a lot of times informs what the theme is going to be for the Met Gala. And so a lot of us basically have jumped to conclusions that since this is the theme, the whole Met Gala theme is going to follow suit in the sense of looking at, Black menswear from the 1700s to the present day. And so I have a lot to say about this because there's a lot of conversation to be had about who can be referenced, what designers should be in the exhibit, and all that sort of stuff that we can talk about, which I'll definitely get into. But to kind of give some context, some more context into this, um, essentially, this theme is an exploration of Black dandyism, and it's inspired by a book by Monica L. Miller, and it's called Slaves to Fashion, Black Dandyism and the Styling of Black Diasporic Identity. I'll put that on the screen for you guys so you can see it. This is the book. And essentially, what this exhibition is going to cover, like I said, is Black male style and Black menswear from the 1700s to the present day. That is very interesting because I think that a lot of times the lens of a lot of fashion exhibitions tends to be through the lens of, like, let's say, European fashion. And of course, like, fashion is fashion. There's fashion everywhere in the world, and it's good to, have a balance. Of course, in the past, we've seen Met Gala themes on, regions of Asia. It'll be good to get like African themes soon, but that's neither here nor there. It's good to see, a theme that's focusing on Black fashion specifically and talking about dandyism in the context of Black style and Black culture. That is really, really interesting. Something funny that I saw as a conversation online was this idea that Anna Wintour is trying to clean up her image because Anna Wintour, of course, it was reported that she wanted the last theme to be John Galliano themed and everything to be about John Galliano. It kind of still ended up being about John Galliano because he damn near had half of the looks at the Met Gala. Obviously, I'm exaggerating, but that's how it seemed. And he's had just a really strong year. So people are like, is this Anna Wintour just trying to clean up her image after having Karl Lagerfeld, who's obviously really controversial, and then not shortly after pushing for a John Galliano themed Met exhibit and Met Gala? So it's quite funny that that was a conversation that people were having. I don't know Anna Wintour personally. Who knows? It probably is, to be fair. It probably is her doing that. But either way, I'll take the win. And it's good to see a different side of fashion being explored because I think that European fashion is overcovered in the sense that as a journalist, it's not that inspiring to read or to go to an exhibit about something historical that happened in European fashion because I went to school and learnt that in school. And when we study history in school, we learn about that. And it's kind of like beating a dead horse. Like in school, we did subcultural lectures where we learnt about new romantics and even old dandies where it was about romanticism. That's why new romantics are even called the new dandies, by the way, if you didn't know. But I've learnt about all that stuff in school. What I didn't learn about was Black dandyism. What I didn't learn about is how Black style historically coincided with that dandyism. And even, just doing my own research on the side, I was quite surprised to see how much Black fashion went side by side. If you talk about dandyism, historically, how much of Black fashion was involved in that. Because when I naturally, based on the history that I've learned and me going to fashion school and learning about dandyism in that sense, when I think of dandyism, I think, of course, of British fashion. That's the first thing that comes to my mind. I think of this archetype of what we think of the dandies when you think of like a perfectly tailored black coat and a long cylinder hat and like knitted scarves and colorful waistcoats and long gloves, and that sort of stuff. And then the ties to aristocracy that normally comes with the old idea of what dandyism is. And then I started to learn that, there were other subsectors of dandyism going on simultaneously. And so what this exhibition, I hope, does is really sheds a light on that and allows us to really understand a lot of cultural things from a 360 lens, not just from a very singular lens of, let's say, what dandyism means or what it represents or what it is historically. And so that's why I find this exhibit really interesting versus a lot of exhibits that I've seen in the past. But it really comes down to how they do it. It can be a really interesting topic and they can fuck it all up, and it's a terrible exhibition and the curation is poor. So I hope that doesn't happen, and I have my fingers crossed and I have my faith up. Of course, because this exhibit is inspired by Miller's book, she's going to serve as a guest curator, which is very important and I think is a good move by them. And of course, it's going to be led by the main curator for the Met, which is Andrew Bolton. There are also chairs that everyone has been talking about because the co-chairs will be Coleman Domingo, Lewis Hamilton, ASAP Rocky, Pharrell Williams, and Anna Wintour. And then you also have LeBron James, who's serving as an honorary chair. So that should be also really interesting to see how they do that, and to see how they're involved. Of course, Louis Vuitton, which is the brand that Pharrell Williams works for, is also a major sponsor for the exhibit and the Met Gala. So should be cool. Should be cool. Should be cool. Sylvester says, I look forward to seeing this exhibition. Hopefully this will influence more exploration in Black and African cultures. I totally agree. I totally agree. Rachel says, hopefully they don't fuck up. I share that same sentiment. Luke says, all the guests will show up in predictably generic suits and completely overlook the intrinsically historical components of the exhibit. A decent theme deserves a decent clientele. I hope, because Luke, like I said earlier, it's such a good theme for the exhibit that to fuck it up would just be a total disaster, because there's so many good things that can come out of it. Like I've just talked about, like history of dandyism and like the associations with Black culture that sort of get left out. I think Black culture, to be fair, gets left out of a lot of movements. Even now, when you think of jazz, a lot of people act like it wasn't Black Americans that, made jazz. And even the style of what we associate with jazz, if we're talking about like zoot suits or certain silhouettes of tailoring, that's all Black Americans, right? But when people think of that, they don't think of that anymore. So it's good to have these exhibits and these historical things where we harken back to the actual history and we uncover these things. But it would be such a shame if the guests of the Met Gala, just go in generic, boring suits and just don't try, because the focus of this is menswear, which also is very rare, especially at the exhibit and also at the gala, which obviously we're assuming that the Met Gala theme will be very similar. Culture says, in just reading some of the historical connotations in the book, there's a wealth of imagination that can be drawn upon. Totally agree. I totally agree. But to talk about like kind of things that I want to see, let's kind of delve into it, because that's really where I think it would be really, really interesting. Oh, Ellen, it's funny that you're saying you only think of Black people, because I have conversations about jazz with people in the UK, and they sometimes when I tell people that, oh yeah, jazz was made by Black Americans, like people don't know what I'm talking about. Like genuinely don't know what I'm talking about. So it's good that you're clued up on history, but a lot of people don't actually know. So yeah, first name that comes to mind when I think of, this theme and who can people reference, the first person that came to my head is Oswald Boateng. Now, I'll tell you why. Reason being, when we think of dandyism, like I said, historically, we first think of British fashion, especially because a lot of the icons, when you think of dandyism historically, come from the UK, right? So Oswald Boateng, being a Black man, first Black man on Savile Row, someone who I genuinely think changed the face of what we think of when we think of Savile Row tailoring. Because Oswald Boateng, for people that don't know, and it's kind of weird that we don't talk about his impact more. It's so strange. Oswald Boateng, right, is a designer who kind of changed what we associate traditional British menswear with. Because when you think of the British tailoring, you think of boxier silhouette. Italian tailoring is more slim. When you think of Savile Row, you think wide, massive lapels, boxy tailoring, shoulder pads, looser fits. And he just came in with a skinnier silhouette, colorful suits, colors that Savile Row tailors would never use, like purple. They would never use that. Tiny ass lapels, right? That, and because it was so different to what was usually on Savile Row, a lot of the tailors on Savile Row at the time were kind of very mean to his work and were always speaking badly about him and saying, oh, he's not a real tailor. What even is this tailoring? This is not real Savile Row tailoring. Savile Row has to follow certain rules. And he kind of broke all the rules of what Savile Row tailoring means. And of course, he made so much noise and he became so influential in tailoring that he eventually became the creative director of Givenchy, where he made a huge impact. He did so many different things. I remember reading, and I think it's even on his website here. Let me see if I can find it, where they were essentially talking about how he was one of the first people to make digital invitations for a fashion runway show and to have like a fashion film as a digital invitation, which was really interesting. And so just had an insane impact, really made Savile Row tailoring mainstream in that sense, brought Savile Row tailoring to the masses. And it's so funny because now when you look at Savile Row, because of the impact of Oswald Boateng and now people thinking that it's okay to, break the rules of Savile Row, now all of a suddenly you go to Savile Row, and I only know this because I worked for a brand where we used to work with Savile Row tailors a few years ago. Half of them follow that traditional, British tailoring aesthetic, and then half of them have just done their own thing and they're kind of innovating what British tailoring means. And I don't think anyone would do that if it wasn't for Oswald Boateng. Oswald Boateng was kind of like the punching bag who had to take all the hate from his fellow Savile Row contemporaries so that he basically crawled so everyone else could walk on Savile Row, especially the less historical tailors who are more new and are kind of doing their own thing. Then you think of his clientele, like people have said in the chat, people like Mick Jagger were wearing Oswald Boateng. You also have people like Will Smith, so many people historically, David Bowie. And so when you think of dandyism, British tailoring, black tailors, black designers, the first designer, honestly, that came to my mind when I put all those things together was Oswald Boateng. So if Oswald is not heavily involved in this exhibit and also, dressing a lot of people for the Met Gala, I will be shocked. I will actually be shocked. I will be like, wow, what a missed opportunity. What a missed opportunity. I'll actually be shocked if that happens. So that was the first person that honestly came to my mind. Nectar Man said he paved the way for Abercrombie and Fitch to open a store in Savile Row. Oh my word. Culture says there's no way Boateng isn't going to be there or included. When was the last time that Oswald Boateng was like a big feature at the Met Gala or the exhibit? I don't think he has been ever. I know he might have dressed a few people here and there for the Met Gala, but he needs to be like one of the main people, to be honest. Like if you talk about all the associations, I don't see a world in which he shouldn't be heavily involved. Like it would just be this is the perfect time. Like all the collaborations he's done with Africa, even the fact that he also started at one point using African prints and he was bringing African prints to Savile Row tailoring. Like there is just no way, absolutely no way that we're going to talk about, tailoring black dandyism and we're not going to mention Oswald Boateng's name, and he's not going to be a major feature of the Met exhibit. So yeah, he was the first name that came to my mind. He is literally the first person that I thought about. Let me know what you guys think. And also let me know if there are other names that you guys think of when you think of, or who you want to see people reference when it comes to this. Another name that came to mind for me is Fela Kuti. Of course, me being Nigerian, Fela Kuti is someone that's an icon from my country, but he's also someone that's very specifically known for having a very different style. People have referred to him as an African dandy and like one of the first original like African dandies. And so when I think of that, I just think of Fela Kuti, like his style, his persona too. Because also, I think when we think of dandyism in general, people think of like a certain aesthetic, but one, there is not one aesthetic that means what dandyism is. Secondly, dandyism, if we're talking about it in the traditional sense, also comes with different aspects. It's not just the clothing, it's like your demeanor and the way you behave in certain situations and the way that you carry yourself. And I think Fela also has that air of like the way he carries himself too. Um, so I would love to see some references to Fela and like his style and kind of like stuff that he's done, outfits he's worn. I would love to see that. I think that would be a good touch. The costumes for Fela the Play were amazing. Oh yeah, I totally agree. Rachel says these people are so cool. No, so I'm actually going to mention Andre Leon Talley. He was actually up next after Fela. I even have the tab open here. Andre Leon Talley, once again, we can't talk about this exhibit and not even talk about Andre Leon Talley. I mean, everything about him epitomizes this idea of like a black dandy. I don't even think there is like a better person that like epitomizes that as a person than Andre Leon Talley, like the quintessential fashion person, the quintessential modern day black dandy. That is Andre Leon Talley to the T. So there should be a lot of references to Andre Leon Talley and his work and also just his style in general, which is why going back to um Luke's earlier point, I would be so surprised if people just come up in plain boring suits considering the wealth of people that can be referenced. Okay, Luke. So what it's interesting that you mentioned Cecil Beaton and Oscar Wilde, but yeah, I see what you mean. 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 Um but yeah, so Andy Taddy is on the list. Of course, people have mentioned someone else who I thought of when I thought about this exhibit. Dapper Dan is also someone who I think really embodies this idea of a black dandy. Dapper Dan should definitely be heavily involved in this. And Bryce says, imagine calling yourself a dandy and having a job. No comment. So Dapper Dan is also someone that I think about. Dapper Dan is someone I think that it'll be good to reference. Then there's also someone else who I have on the list. Someone has mentioned it in the chat. The Congolese sapeurs, of course, the Congolese sapeurs. Like who else? And it's quite interesting because I'm not sure how many people know, but there's a subsect of the Congolese sapeurs that love Yoji Yamamoto and like they wear his stuff and mix Yoji with like other pieces. Let me see if I can find an image of them. But like it'll be great to also talk about them and like historically and how they came to be and have a section in the exhibit kind of like focusing on that, especially because I don't know how much of the exhibit will focus on like African specific aesthetics, right? How do you think non-black guests should interpret the theme? I don't think not being black means that you interpret the theme in a different way, Maya, if that makes sense. So you don't have to be black to reference, an Andre Leon Talley look or like a Fela Kuti outfit or to be dressed by Oswald Boateng. You know what I mean? I think they just need to do some research, look historically, and see who like has a very interesting style and who also can represent this idea of black dandyism, and then kind of reference that. I don't think what race you are should really affect how you dress or who you can work with or who you can't work with, if that makes sense. So I don't think it should matter too much, to be honest. At least that's my personal opinion. Yeah, the dress code will be dandyism, so it'll be accessible to everyone. But yeah, I don't think I think it will still have some form of like, especially because the exhibit is very specific to black menswear from the 1700s to the present day. So I can imagine that they will focus on still kind of like black fashion in the theme. It will just be a bit wider, of course. At least Anna can't throw in any Chanel pieces into this exhibit, as she always finds a way to do. That's funny. Yeah, if the theme is just dandyism as a whole, I can see a lot of people dressing like Oscar Wilde for sure. But I think, see, this is what I hate about the Met Gala sometimes, right? What I hate about the Met Gala is people don't like to think or do any research. Like Oscar Wilde is such a like, oh, the theme is dandyism. Let's do Oscar Wilde. It's so boring, or it's so obvious that it makes it boring and it's not interesting. Like, why don't you do some research and find out like a designer that like isn't that well known, and you can actually add or teach people about history because you're referencing something that people will then have to research. Like, at least if I was a celebrity that went to the Met Gala, I would do that. I think doing Oscar Wilde is just so like it's been beaten like a dead horse. It's so exactly. It's just so lazy to do something like Oscar Wilde. It's so yeah. He said research in 2024, 25. Oh, you're asking for a lot. Like, do you know how many people I've seen reference Oscar Wilde? Like, let's do something else. Sylvester says, I hope they include black designers like Julie Bett, Gordon Henderson, Eric Gaskins, Willie Smith, Anne Lowe, Stephen Burrows, Patrick Kelly. Maybe at least a mention. That's a good point. I mean, Jesus, Patrick Kelly, sorry, Stephen Burrows, Anne Lowe, Willie Smith, like legends, 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 legends. I hope they get included too. Definitely an interesting conversation to have. Miles Davis, even if was a horrible person, had mad outfits. True. And also, if we're talking about Miles Davis in the context of jazz and in the context of how jazz kind of informed this idea of what we call Black Dandyism, I think it could be important historically. But I think if, you know, Anna Wintour is kind of using this exhibit theme as a way to clean up her image, then she will probably want to steer away from any more controversy after the whole John Galliano and Karl Lagerfeld thing. So, yeah, I think it just depends, to be honest. I think it just depends. But yeah, I think they're going to stay away from Miles Davis for reasons that I won't mention in this stream. This is also a good point, by the way. There's a Caribbean flavor that can come through if you look at the Saga Boys and the Rude Boys. Facts. That is fact. Someone mentioned Wells Bonner. So funny enough, I didn't have Wells Bonner on my list, but that's actually a very, very good point because Wells Bonner kind of has that aesthetic of like, and it's where her references come from, right? It's like diasporic African style is a lot of where her references come from. So that fits perfectly into the exhibit. So actually, I think Wells Bonner would also be a good shout to dress a lot of people and to also be featured in the exhibit itself at the Met. So yeah, really cool. I'm really, really looking forward to how this develops. And of course, looking forward to the next Met Gala and seeing what the theme actually becomes of the Met Gala, which is different to the exhibit, as I've mentioned before, but also to see how celebrities style things and how they interpret the theme. I just really hope that we don't fumble the bag. I really hope we don't fumble the bag. Someone said Andre 3000. That's a good shout too. Andre over the years has had really cool style, really different. People have referred to him as a black dandy too. Kind of similar in the sense of like Andre Leon Talley. So yeah, I can definitely see the Andre 3000 look. Maya says it's the Met Gala eye, the bag is always fumbled. But why though? Okay, I understand. I understand that celebrities aren't necessarily fashion people in the sense that, okay, cool. I went to fashion school, so I learned about so much fashion history that when I see themes like this, I just think of so many different things that can be referenced. I understand that, like, the typical celebrity or the typical A-lister musician, actress doesn't really know about fashion history like that. But that's why they have stylists. That's why they have other people that are supposed to know these things. Like, where are the stylists doing the research? Those are the people that I think we should blame more so than the celebrities because that's not their job. It's the stylist that I blame, honestly. I just hope the men aren't going to bore us as they usually do every year. This would be the worst time for the men to pull out something boring, considering that literally the exhibit is focusing on menswear. Like, how can the exhibit focus on menswear? And the menswear looks are terrible. That at that point is just like, don't come to the Met Gala again. Literally, just going forward, just stay at home. We don't need you at the Met Gala anymore. And Leo says we cannot blame all the celebs. I blame stylists and probably Anna. Does Anna have any input in what people wear though? I don't really think she does. We finna see a bunch of Italian designed boxy suits. I hope not. Oral Health says, but you must have stylists that are doing the research. Also, don't come with a black tux. Exactly my point. There are 90s editions of magazines like Vogue and others that used to feature various supermodels and dandy styles, like Shalom Harlow. That's actually a really good point. Also, we can kind of reference other magazines, like even Ebony magazine, and see like during that time period, like in the 90s and stuff, like what were some of the features and are there like looks that kind of fit into this idea of black dandyism and black tailoring? So that would be really cool. Oh yeah, exactly what Sylvester said. Just as I mentioned it, I wonder if they will include a mention from Ebony and Ebony Fashion Fair. Exactly. I think it'll be a missed opportunity if they don't. So it'll be really good to see that. And this is why I was so happy, because one of the first thoughts when I saw that this was the theme of the exhibit, and let me just put that back on the screen for people that are new. I was thinking, who is going to be the curator of this? Because Andrew Bolton? Do I trust Andrew Bolton to know about black fashion history? I don't think so. Black tailoring and black style, and to know about black subcultures. Andrew Bolton? I don't think so. So that's why I was like, okay, cool. At least, first of all, Monica L. Miller is one of the co-curators. That's a good start. It's good. I want to see them involve more people that actually come from that world, because I can imagine that Angie Bolton probably doesn't know much about black history historically. He needs to consult black historians, black designers, um, black writers, he needs to. Otherwise, it's going to make for a very terrible exhibition, in my personal opinion. Um, so that's why I was really happy when they involved Monica L. Miller. It was literally the first thing I was looking for, because I was like, Andrew Bolton, I'm not too sure about that. They need to communicate with the folks at Ebony and Essence. They absolutely must. I'm with you there. Yep, exactly what everyone is saying. Again, he needs black curators on his staff. He does. He does. Because I think that, and I don't, once again, every time I talk about like non-Western fashion, people get really sensitive and I don't understand why. Like if I say that, oh, fashion is really Western centric, I'm just saying it as like a fact. I'm not necessarily saying if it's like, the most horrific thing in the world, or it's good or it's bad. That's not even a conversation I'm having, because if we think of the fashion industry as it was created, it is a very like French concept, right? So it makes sense that then most of it would revolve around France. It's more to have the conversation around there isn't a lot of balance. And so it makes for journalists that don't really understand a lot of fashion outside of the West, or designers that only reference the same thing. So when I normally talk about fashion being Western centric, I talk about it in the lens of like fashion not moving forward, because designers, do you know how many designers I've seen reference the pre-Raphaelites? Do you know how many designers I've seen reference Margiela? Do you know how many designers I've seen reference let me think of something really obvious like brutalism, right? But there's a big world out there, and there's so many other references that can be referenced outside of like these very narrow things that designers like. It seems like they're beating a dead horse. So when I talk about fashion being a lot of Western centric, I'm not even really critiquing like, oh my god, it's too white. That's not even a conversation I'm having. I'm saying that fashion is stagnating because a lot of designers aren't taught to look or be inspired by things outside of like stuff that they're taught. If you're a fashion person, you're an art person, about futurism, and about brutalism, and it's these like very European Western centric movements that like everyone knows about and everyone references, and so everyone ends up just doing the same thing year after year. So that's more my critique with it. And so what happened, and this is going back to Andrew Bolton, what then happens is you have someone like Andrew Bolton who, as a curator, I can imagine he probably doesn't really know much about Black or African history, because when I was in school, I made sure that all my projects were about some sort of like African or Asian fashion. That's why when I was at CSM, I did a documentary in South Africa, and I did my designer project on Tebe Magugu's work and all that sort of stuff, because in school, we're going to learn about the European stuff. We're already going to learn about that. So there's no point me beating a dead horse. I learned about that in lectures. I learned about 18th century fashion, 19th century fashion in school. I learned about that in lectures. So there's no point then doing further projects about that. So it normally tends to be, let's say, Africans like me that then go and seek the extra information. Whereas I've noticed talking to other European journalists, maybe because personally they don't have any connection to Africa or connection to Asia personally, they don't do the extra work to learn about anything outside of like these very obvious historical movements that we learn about in fashion and in fashion history. And so that's why I was thinking, who is going to help curate this exhibition? Who is going to be involved? I hope it's not just Andrew Bolton, because if it's only Andrew Bolton without him consulting the right people, there's an issue there. There's a big issue there, and it's going to make for a very terrible exhibition, in my opinion. So that's why, like I'm saying once again, that's why the thought came to my mind. That was my thought process. Someone says, you know what it is though, the name goes a long way, so they just get someone experienced to cover it and have the ethnic as support staff, but low-key that means you're missing a personal dimension. Totally agree. It's so the norm that sometimes stuff that's a part of mainstream fashion in various parts of Asia or Africa is viewed as alternative, even if it isn't really. 100% agree. Phila says, I don't want Bolton's claws on this gala. I'm with you though. I'm with you. I don't think that because I've worked in fashion for long enough to know that I don't think I've actually ever met a white fashion historian. And once again, I've explained why it makes sense that they wouldn't look into these things, maybe because they don't have a personal connection to it. But I've never actually met like a white fashion journalist or fashion historian that deeply knows anything about African fashion, for example, or like black fashion historically ever. I've only met one person that does, only one. And even though she's white, she's South African. So does it count? Does it count? Because she's South African anyway. So I guess that's where the personal connection comes in. And she's very, very knowledgeable about like African history, more so than I could ever be, to be honest. And so because of that, someone like Andrew Bolton, I can just assume, I don't know him personally, but based on my experience working in fashion, I can just assume that he doesn't have the bandwidth for an exhibition like this, to be honest. Wasn't there a plaque for Tommy Hilfiger one year for the American fashion one saying that he deliberately marketed to the black community rather than the proof that people took it and made it theirs? Yeah, I remember that. So many more conversations to have. I'm sure we will revisit this topic in the future because there's a lot to be said, especially closer to the time when the exhibit is going to be announced. This YouTube channel runs on your support. If you want to support the channel, you can subscribe to my Patreon. You'll gain access to exclusive content that includes everything from my Patreon podcast, where I give a behind-the-scenes insight into the fashion industry, as well as a fashion book club, where I review my favorite fashion books. You can also check out my fashion ebook, which highlights the best fashion journalists to follow, definitions of common fashion terminology, and how to determine what a good source of fashion information is. The links to everything are in the description below.